You probably know that I have made a lot of things from chocolate over the years, from replicating artworks like Picasso, to Roy Lichtenstein's pop art and Jeff Koons' balloon dog, through to real life objects. Do you remember the chocolate tools? Chocolate is easy to mould and soft enough to carve, so it's great to work with. And you can of course make it interesting by adding different fillings into the centre. But by far the best part is giving away chocolate creations, especially if they're giant.
That tastes like a full-on Mars bar. Are you joking?
Is that actually a thing? What's inside it?
And despite doing all of that, there's still one thing in chocolate that I have never done that I really want to try, and that is 3D printing in chocolate. There is only one problem though, which is 3D food printers are really, really expensive. There's some huge industrial ones like this one that spreads out a really thin layer of icing sugar and then prints liquid colour binding and repeats that thin layer by thin layer to build up a 3D sugar design. They look pretty cool. There's another huge setup that was made to print pastry dough and then add different fillings depending on the nutritional needs of each individual person that would be eating it. So that's pretty interesting. As far as chocolate printing goes though, not many of them print in real chocolate. Most of them are set up just to print in compound chocolate. I did find one that said it prints in real chocolate and it looks great. I mean, that looks beautiful. But it costs $8,000 US, so quite a bit out of my budget. A little bit cheaper than that and you can get yourself a food printer, which Mr. Who's the Boss rated in his video on his worst tech purchases of the year.
I made mixture after mixture. I tried sweet with cookie dough to the exact recipe that the product told me to, and I just could not get it to work. I had mixtures that dribbled. I had explosions where literally food particles reached the wall behind you. I ended up resorting to 2D shapes, but couldn't even do that.
Come down a bit in price from that one and you can get this one.
It's a kit. And I have to manufacture the rest of the parts with a boring, non-chocolate 3D printer.
So I have to 3D print out a whole bunch of different parts. It was definitely just a different process, making sure I followed all of the steps in the like 215-page manual. And so all in all, it took me about 10 or 11 hours, start to finish, to build this 3D printer.
It took him 10 hours to build it, and he is what I would call a 3D printing expert. He has a whole massive room full of 3D printers. I, on the other hand, don't even own one 3D printer. So I would have to buy a 3D printer first in order to print out all of the parts. Or you can pay the company an extra $250 US to print all the parts for you, which brings the grand total to $2,000 US, and it can only print in compound chocolate. And the results are, well, shall we say, varied.
Benching might be a challenge for chocolate, and it's not looking so good. Uh-oh. Oh no, what happened? It's just a mess of chocolate now.
It's not a 3D printer for someone's very first 3D printer. You definitely have to know the nuances of a 3D printer because, I mean, just off the bat, having to assemble it, all of the tweaks you have to make as you're printing to kind of get used to the chocolate, get used to the environment, and all of those details.
So it looks like you can get that one to work really well if you're a 3D printing expert and you have the money to pay for it. James ended up using his to print Nutella.
After hours and hours of trial and error, we have it, the perfect spread of Nutella.
By far the cheapest option is to buy an extruder and add that to an existing 3D printer, which I of course don't have. And it's not just a matter of clicking it on, you actually have to completely sacrifice the printer, pull it apart, cut all the wires, rewire it all and put it on, and even in their own flashy promo video, the results look questionable. See what I mean? And the customer reviews, well, they made the promo video look great.
Pushing on the tube causes it to extrude from the nozzle, so I know that the nozzle isn't clogged either, but the motor doesn't seem to have enough torque to actually push the chocolate through.
So not that one. I did like the look of this extruder from a guy in Ukraine, but it's no longer available and it looked really hard to install.
48 hours of just problems. The main board on my Ender 3 actually got killed because the supplied motor cable may have reversed polarity depending on which printer you are using, which will kill the extruder driver on your motherboard.
So that leaves me with one option, to build my own. Now, given that I don't own a 3D printer, that means I'm starting at absolute beginner level. Now, I would love it if 3D printing was as easy as those Star Trek food replicators. Computer, watermelon. But in reality, I know that it's not going to be that easy. Honestly, this might be the worst idea I've had in a long time, given I'm not an engineer and I don't own a 3D printer and all of these things are stacked against me. But surely I can't be the only one who wants to try printing 3D food at home who doesn't want to spend thousands of dollars on the project. If you look on Printables and Thingiverse, there are lots of different 3D models for paste extruders. So I'm wondering if we could use one of those to 3D print food. I don't like the idea of rewiring, and if I'm going to the expense of buying a 3D printer, I want to be able to use it as a 3D printer as well. I don't want to destroy it. So for that reason, I chose the Sovol SV06, not sponsored. I chose it specifically, one, because it was one of the cheaper ones, but two, because all of the wires conveniently plug into the one spot on the printer head. So I thought if I buy a second printer head, I can muck around with that one to turn it into an extruder, and then I can just undo the 3 screws and swap the different printer heads in and out. So that way I've got a filament printer and hopefully a food printer all in the one package for much cheaper than any of the ones that you can purchase. I found this printer pretty easy to use right out of the box. It printed a Benchy perfectly. If you're new to 3D printing like me, Benchy is short for benchmark. This print is basically one that challenges the printer because it's got slopes, it's got overhangs, it's got bridging, it's got all of the things that can be difficult to print in 3D. So if you can print a Benchy, you're doing pretty well. Now, to be honest, a 3D printer is pretty useful for making all different shapes for chocolate. You could make whatever shape you wanted to print and then mold that in reusable food grade molding gel and then fill the mold with chocolate, and there you have a custom shaped chocolate. You can even see all the 3D printing lines in it because chocolate picks up every little detail. There's a pastry chef in Ukraine who's well known for using 3D printing to design different shapes for desserts, and then she'll take a mold from that and make amazing looking desserts. Now, while all that is great, there are some things that just can't be molded. They're just too finicky, too detailed, have too many sort of holes in them that when you're trying to pull the mold off, the chocolate would just break. And it would be awesome if you could print something like this. I chose this paste extruder model off Printables and bought all the fixtures it said we needed and printed all the 3D parts and bought a syringe and a second print head. Not only does this have the connection that I like, but it's also got other parts that I want, like the sensor and the hot end. I also got some wires just in case I need them. I hope not. And one very important fact is under the assembly instructions it says coming soon. So we're on our own. To start with, let's pull the print head apart. This particular model was made for a different printer to the one I'm using, so we might have to adapt the model a bit anyway. It said we needed to use heat set inserts. I'd never heard of them before, but apparently using the tip on a soldering iron, they just melt into the 3D print to make a strong screw hold. That's pretty clever, look at that. The assembly seemed pretty straightforward except for trying to heat sink the piece into the shaft. The depth wasn't wide enough to accommodate the piece. I also had to make adjustments for this piece because there was no room for the lead screw nut, so I had to melt that into the gear. At this point I'm beginning to wonder if this model has ever been printed before. Normal 3D nozzles have a tiny 0.4mm hole, but for this job I'm going to use a 1.5mm nozzle. And because I've got a Luer lock syringe, you can get different adapters, so I've got one that will fit from the heat block screw-in hole to the syringe. Add the sensor to the side, fill the syringe with Nutella for its first test. Add the contraption to the printer and put down a silicone mat, and here we go. I forgot to adjust the height the nozzle is from the board. Second try. Nothing's coming out. The motor is not even turning this rod at all for some reason. So then I took the syringe and the Nutella out of the equation just to see if the motor would turn just with nothing, with no load at all. It's still not working. So at this point I thought maybe I'd broken the motor somehow, or maybe it came broken. So I spent half a day driving around stores trying to find a replacement motor and ended up being able to get a slightly bigger one secondhand, but there's still no movement. Nothing. So then I thought maybe the cable that attaches the motor was damaged, so I swapped that from the other print head, but still nothing, no movement at all. So finally I thought perhaps when I was building everything I might have damaged the PCB board, the bit that is on the back that everything connects to. So I took that off the other print head and put it onto this one, and still no movement from the motor. It was then that I did some research online and found out that 3D printers will not print if the heat block is below a certain temperature. I've got mine set to body temperature, which is about right for printing Nutella, but normally they would be 175 degrees Celsius, enough to melt the plastic filament so that you can print with it. It turns out that we can override that if we go into the G code, which sounded complicated to me, but in reality that was one of the easiest steps. You just go into the program they gave you and click on the printer and manage settings, and you can add stuff there. 5 letters, and I've tried all of these different complicated things and none of them mattered. Okay, let's test it out now with the original motor, which has nothing wrong with it. Finally, the motor is turning, but can you hear that horrible sound? It's not strong enough to turn the gears. So then I swapped it back to the bigger motor, and let's see if that works. The motor is turning beautifully, but if you look up the top, the gears are still. The shaft is spinning, but the gear is not gripping it enough to turn. And if I try and tighten that little grub screw, the nut just comes out. Unfortunately, I think we need to try a completely different model. Every model uses a different size syringe, and I have a Luer-Lock syringe now, so I'm going to have to attempt to modify any model that we choose from here to fit that syringe. Did I mention I've never done anything in 3D modeling before? I've never used Blender before, so this is a whole new learning curve. Please don't judge my Blender skills or lack thereof. Just as well I can swap this back to the normal printer head easily by doing up these 3 screws and starting printing. 16 hours later, and it's nearly done. The 3D printing process is very slow. Okay, and now it's assembly time. I'll link you to these models on the website in case you want to try any of them. Sadly, with this model, the supplied motor cable is not long enough to reach from the motor to the print head, so I'm going to have to make it longer. It's time to see if this one works. What to do? I tried the same setup with an empty syringe to see if that would work, and it turns fine. So to cut a long story short, it can't print something as thick as Nutella through a fine nozzle, even if I make modifications to the syringe. So I tried some royal icing instead, and I have never been so happy to see gears turning. But this is without a nozzle, and even that was getting stuck. Uh-oh. With a nozzle on, it was even worse, as you can imagine. I kept trying and changing settings, and then I discovered if I slow the print speed right down, it was able to print remarkably better than it did before. Still not perfect, but better. It was, however, still getting stuck every now and then. So then I wondered if the low print speed would work for Nutella as well. And with no nozzle, for the majority of the time, the gears are actually spun fine, but then sometimes, like that, they got stuck. But it's still managing to turn out a thick, flat Nutella Benchy, so that is progress. But put the nozzle on, and it can't handle the pressure. So it's back to the drawing board. We're going to have to design our own extruder, And I know what I want in my head. I just think my 3D abilities in Blender are so lacking. This is going to be a challenge, but I'll give it a go. In the first model that we tried, the gears had a ratio of 1 to 2. This one has double the number of teeth, which means it doubles the torque or the rotational force output that we can get from the motor, but that wasn't enough. The second model that we tried had a ratio of 1 to 4. This has 4 times as many teeth, so it's increasing the torque output by 4 times, which was strong enough with no nozzle for Nutella, but as you know, not strong enough with a nozzle on. The one I've just designed and printed has a huge gear and a tiny gear. So this has a ratio of 1 to 8, and I'm hoping that this is going to work. My 3D modeling skills have a lot to be desired, but in this model, for the syringe holder, I chopped the top off so the syringe can be turned, because I need to be able to twist it to put it onto the lure lock so I can attach it to that heat block. And then I also needed a way to hold it in place. So I've added hinges here so that we can get the syringe in and out and lock it into place. And I had to extend this to make room for the new bigger gears. I extended these ones to make the distance right for the new gears, and then of course forgot to extend this further out. It took 20 hours to print, so instead of starting again, I just printed a little C-clamp to hold it in place. So if we build this model, it looks like this. Now, if I turn it by hand, I'm not sure if you can see that on camera, but as soon as there is any pressure in that syringe, this whole top section is bending up rather than the plunger going down. So we'll have to take this piece off and brace it down to here. So now it's holding this bit in place and stopping the whole top section from moving up. Attach it to the printer and surprise, surprise, there's another problem. Now the gear is so big that it's hitting the upright of the printer. So to solve that problem, I'm just going to add a magnet here. So when it goes to home, it bumps into the magnet before it hits the gear. Okay, here we go. Adjust the settings for speed and flow rate, and it's finally strong enough to extrude Nutella through a nozzle. So you need a gear ratio of 1 to 8 for this to work with this size motor. I didn't want to add a bigger motor because it would get too heavy on the print head and then we're not going to get a steady print. Now that the setup is working, you just need to dial in your settings on the printer to get the layer height and the flow rate right. To get to this point was so much harder than I thought it was going to be. It was a steep learning curve and a good lesson in perseverance and never giving up. I did have grand plans of adding a heating mat around the syringe and a thermistor and wiring that into where the printer currently controls the temperature for the heat bed so that we could use it for chocolate and keep the syringe warm. I'm out of time, so I can't do that, but I just really want to see if it will print chocolate. So I'm going to put some chocolate in the syringe. Of course, it's going to set fairly quickly because I can only heat the nozzle and not the syringe part, but let's give it a go. And that is extruding beautifully well for now. Obviously that chocolate is going to be getting colder and setting hard, so I think we're only going to get a couple of layers out of it before it starts setting in the syringe. But we've made some really good progress here. It's actually looking like it's kind of possible to make your own chocolate printer at home. I'll throw all the details of this build along with my terrible 3D models onto the website so you can download them from there and take it and fingers crossed make it even better. With thanks to my amazing patrons for all of your support. Make it a great week by being kind to others, and I'll see you on Friday.